Coming up in today's newscast, the United States merges its Palestinian mission in Jerusalem into its newly built embassy complex. Israel's High Court of Justice delays the demolition of Khan Al Ahmar, and the 4th annual Round Tables Culinary Festival gets prepared to return to Tel Aviv.
Israel today is reopening the Gaza crossing checkpoints thanks to what the Defense Ministry has called a relative calm. This, however, despite a weekend still practically full of terrorist activity.
IDF forces first ramped up their activity along the Gaza border in a show of force Thursday afternoon, just a day after a rocket from Gaza landed on a Beersheva home. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror organization still deny any involvement in the attack, though, and blame outside forces for attempting to sabotage Egyptian and UN-led negotiations with Israel via the attack. The weekly Hamas-organized riots along the Gaza-Israel border on Friday were also relatively small, with protesters numbering just around 10,000, a third of several previous weekends. Still, those who did arrive set fire to tires and threw them over the fence. They also again threw grenades and explosives at the Israeli forces across the border and at the security barrier itself. 130 Palestinians were reportedly shot and wounded by IDF forces in efforts to push them back. Saturday morning, fires sparked by incendiary balloons broke out along the Israel-Gaza border region near Kisufim, Be'eri, and Shekoda forests. No injuries were reported, and IAF jets later attacked a terror cell in the southern Gaza Strip that was launching the incendiary balloons. But a few Palestinians Saturday morning managed to break into Israel and film their seemingly easy trip. They even hung a photo of a supposed Palestinian martyr on an abandoned sniper post. Later, Israeli police arrested a 20-year-old Palestinian man in the settlement of Har Adar outside Jerusalem. He was armed with a knife, and investigations established that the suspect first breached the separation barrier and then walked through a forest to get to the settlement, intent on carrying out a terror attack. Thankfully, the suspect only walked about 30 meters into the settlement before being noticed by a security guard who alerted authorities.
Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority is now again denouncing the United States after Secretary of State Pompeo's announcement last week. Pompeo reported Washington's intent to merge its main diplomatic mission in East Jerusalem for the Palestinians with its new embassy complex in Jerusalem.
Pompeo reiterated that the United States continues to take no position on final status issues, though, including boundaries or borders, leaving such decisions up to the result of direct negotiations. That, and that the move is meant to, quote, achieve significant efficiencies and increase our effectiveness, end quote. But the Palestinian Authority sees this as yet another downgrading in relations and a major blow to the United States' position as a partner and intermediary in peace.
The American State Department's decision to merge the consulate with the so-called embassy is a further step in trying to dictate the results of negotiations and to move from negotiations to dictations. It's part of the so-called deal of the century, meaning they want to take off Jerusalem off the table, refugees and settlements off the table. And it's being dictated by a group of extremist ideologues in the U.S. administration.
In addition to this move, Trump's administration has also recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moved the United States Embassy to Jerusalem shortly thereafter, cut funding to Palestinian aid organizations, and closed the PLO offices in Washington. All moves that the Palestinians have publicly stated they feel were hostile. Pompeo insists, however, that the United States will, quote, continue to conduct a full range of reporting, outreach, and programming in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as with Palestinians in Jerusalem through a new Palestinian Affairs unit inside the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, end quote. Israel's Channel 2 News also even reported that President Trump sent World Jewish Congress President Ron Lauder as a personal envoy to President Abbas last week. Time will tell how the Palestinians will respond if and when the move comes to fruition.
Chagai El-Ad, the Director General of pro-Palestinian NGO B'Tselem, addressed the United Nations Security Council on Thursday, where he leveled accusations of intolerable behaviors at the feet of Israeli officials who claim his speech did nothing but undermine Israeli security at home and abroad. Well, now some in the government are taking the criticisms one step further, calling for a complete dismantling of the B'Tselem NGO. Well, returning to the studio with analysis is Director of External Relations for Im Tirtzu, Eitan Meir. Eitan, thanks for coming back in.
Good to be here.
All right, so first of all, again, let's just start off with some of El-Ad's comments. He opened his speech really discussing the status quo, and he called the Israeli status quo, he said it was a calculated and deliberate process of splitting people up from one another, from their land, disrupting their lives and isolating them to make them easier to oppress. What's your initial reaction to that?
I mean, we hear this nonsense all the time, but I don't really want to talk about Chagai Elad because he's really nothing. He's one piece in a really large industry fueled by foreign governments who fund Israeli NGOs in order to do exactly this, to slander Israel abroad, to petition the Israel Supreme Court on behalf of terrorists, to also petition the Israeli court against the IDF. So what this really is a manifestation of just the real tactic of the foreign governments. What they use is, we call it a salami tactic. They take all different parts of the country and knock off and cut off a different part of it. You have the South. They say, what we're doing with the Bedouins, they build illegally, it doesn't matter. You're trying to move them, that's a war crime. So it's illegitimate what you're doing in the South. Gaza, we don't even need to talk about that. War crimes, cross off Gaza. Jerusalem, segregation, cross it off. Judea and Samaria, apartheid, cross it off. The Golan, occupied, and there's nothing left.
So you're saying that this is just a pure slander? You're saying there's no meat or substance to these accusations?
Of course, all these organizations, they're not human rights organizations. They couldn't care about human rights. They're just trying to advance a political agenda, which is, in their view, to force Israel to do things that Israel doesn't want to do, the people don't want to do, and the elected officials that were voted by the people shouldn't be doing it. That's all.
So do you agree then that these types of comments should, they go beyond simple criticisms then and are actionable offenses against the government?
I mean, when you take, as you say, airing your dirty laundry abroad, that's really the issue, is that all these organizations, essentially, they get money from foreign governments, and then on behest of their foreign patrons, they go speak to the UN, essentially to their bosses. I mean, it's kind of a vicious cycle. So I think what really needs to be done is we really have to start cracking down on these organizations and say, listen, you get money from foreign governments to harm the state of Israel, take away all your nonprofit status, you get discount on property tax, no more. You get discount on income tax, no more. And you start getting taxed.
But the personal attack on this NGO or another NGO, that, or any really BDS activists or politically unaffiliated or rather I should say dissident, politically dissident, going after that doesn't set a bar that, where a pendulum can swing the other way with a different government?
No, that's exactly why it has to be something quantifiable. And it can't just be something that you mentioned, the law. It can't just be someone who acts out against the government, because we want to have something that says you could actually say, okay, they get X amount of money.
Sure.
Exactly. Criticism is great. Everyone, we encourage it. But when you start getting money from foreign governments, that's the real issue. So as I talked about the ability to quantify something, you say if they get X amount of money from foreign governments, that means they should lose X amount of nonprofit status. And that's something that we really need to start pushing, because this is a serious issue.
Eitan Mayo, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
All right, in related news, the much anticipated ruling on the illegally built Bedouin village Khan Al Ahmar has come down, and the Israeli High Court of Justice has surprised us all. It ruled that there was no legal reason not to continue with the demolition of the village, but that demolition should be postponed indefinitely anyway, in preference of a negotiated settlement.
Initially, it was reported that Prime Minister Netanyahu had decided Saturday to postpone the demolition in response to the court ruling. But in a press conference today with United States Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin in Jerusalem, Netanyahu said no such thing. During their meeting, the two officials discussed regional stability, Iran, and more. But afterwards, in response to a reporter's question on the Bedouin village, the premier reiterated his support for the legal system's authority while rejecting the possibility that the village demolition will be deferred forever.
Khan Al Ahmar יפונה. זו החלטה של בית משפט, זו המדיניות שלנו והיא גם תתבצע. אין לי כוונה לדחות את זה עד להודעה חדשה בניגוד לפרסומים, אלא למועד קצוב וקצר, ומשך הזמן שניתן לנסות לפנות את זה בהסכמה ייקבע על ידי הקבינט. אני אכנס אותו היום ונקבע, זה יהיה קצר, ואני מאמין שזה גם יהיה בהסכמה.
No new date has yet been given for the demolition, though, leading Palestinian activists and officials, as well as some human rights groups, to cheer the ruling as a step in the right direction. But protesters seem to know that the fight is far from over, leading many to state intentions to continue protests and demonstrations until the demolition is canceled outright. Khan Al Ahmar was ordered to be destroyed back in May last year, as the village was established illegally without building permits. It also supposedly sits too closely to the highway, making it arguably a dangerous place to live. Israeli officials argue that the Bedouins didn't follow proper channels to get building permits, and that anyway, the government intends to simply relocate the roughly 200 Bedouin villagers towards the nearby settlement of Abu Dis. But Palestinians have argued that Israel intentionally makes it difficult for Palestinians, Arabs, and Bedouins to get building permits, forcing people to resort to building illegally. And that despite the new intended site having hookups to water, electricity, sewage, and a new school building, Palestinians from Abu Dis nearby have warned not to take the deal. The planned site reportedly was chosen without consulting the villagers, doesn't suit a rural Bedouin lifestyle, and is apparently just next to a garbage dump. Still, if Netanyahu and other coalition heads follow through with their statements, it's only a matter of time before the village of Khan Al Ahmar is destroyed, one way or another.
In just 16 days, American voters will be going to the polls for the midterm elections across the United States. And this election is set to be a crucial one, not just for the future of the United States, but also for the future relationship between the United States and Israel. Now, ILTV correspondent Doriel Mizrahi joins us with the details. So, Doriel, what are the major concerns regarding the election in Israel then?
Hey, Aaron. Well, first, in response to Trump and the Republican victories in recent years, there's been a concerted effort to get young, fresh blood into the Democratic Party. But it's pretty much being made clear that amongst the rising stars running for Congress, there's a growing tide of very strong anti-Israel positions. Take candidates Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Leslie Cockburn, and a few others, for example. These four at times have taken extreme stances on Israel and the Palestinian. But what's more absurd is that others in the Democratic Party have largely remained silent on these candidates' statements.
Can you give us any examples?
Yeah, well, in recent interviews, there's this Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez candidate, and she said Israel is an occupying force and massacres Gazans. But then when she was asked what facts is she basing this on, she replied she didn't have vast knowledge and is quote-unquote no expert. I also mentioned Ilhan Omar, who just straight up called Israel an apartheid regime, and she also tweeted that Israel is hypnotizing the world to ignore its evil doings. Then there's also Rashida Tlaib, who's running unopposed for Congress and said she will absolutely vote against military aid to Israel.
And what about Leslie Cockburn, because you mentioned her too?
Right. She co-authored a book with her husband, which she directly advocates anti-Semitism. And again, no one in the Democratic Party is really condemning this at all. And this is a big step away from the norm in policy towards Israel. Typically, support for Israel was practically unchallenged across the aisle in Washington.
Well, from what I can tell, a lot of this is coming from a general ignorance on Israel. You mentioned yourself that Cortez, for example, couldn't back up any of her statements. And honestly, how surprising is it, to see this shift in ideology in a party that fails to condemn guys like Louis Farrakhan?
And that's my point exactly. Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who's also now running for Congress, compared Jews to termites, just like the Nazis, in a video he uploaded to social media just last week. And by the way, the crowd laughed at this so-called joke. But his comments were so extreme that Facebook blocked the video for violating their community standards. And former First Daughter Chelsea Clinton actually tweeted that the incident made her skin crawl. And in the past, he's happily compared himself to Hitler and incited hatred and violence against the United States, whites in America, Jews, and more. But still, few Democrats really stood up to this or urged others to stand up. Some have come out and reiterated Democratic support for Israel, but they didn't speak out against any specific anti-Israel rhetoric within the party. And Louis Farrakhan has often been seen with top Democrats like President Obama and Bill Clinton just as recently as this past summer.
Okay, so again, back to the big question then. How will all this likely affect Israel-United States relations?
Well, again, all this can be considered symptomatic of long-time trends. But between 2001 and 2016, the share of liberal Democrats who sympathized more with Israel than the Palestinians have declined from 33% to 19%. So today there's nearly twice as many liberal Democrats that say they sympathize more with Palestinians than they do with Israel.
So I guess the moral of the story is just to be really sure you know who you're voting for and why. So yeah, I suppose you'll be back here in 2 weeks after the midterms, so you can fill us in with how it all turned out. Thanks for your report.
Thanks for having me.
Lara Alqasem, the alleged BDS activist from Florida, is now allowed to enter Israel to enroll in her master's program at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem following the Israeli High Court's ruling on Thursday. This after the initial ban against her was upheld by two previous courts over the past 2 weeks.
Alqasem, therefore, was denied entry because she was previously the head of her university's chapter of the pro-BDS anti-Israel group, Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. It was initially reported, though, that Alqasem stopped her activities in SJP months before Israel passed its law to prevent BDS activists from entering. And although it was later found that Alqasem appeared in an SJP photo posted months after she allegedly left the group, the ruling still went in Alqasem's favor. Part of the judge's reasoning is reportedly because the Israel consulate in Miami granted her a student visa, and she had already been accepted into the Hebrew University for her program. Judges said the standards for revoking a visa should be higher. Alan Dershowitz, a constitutional law scholar and professor of law at Harvard University, said simply, quote, "I strongly support the court's decision. Israel never should have detained her," end quote. According to Lara Alqasem, Al-Qasem's defense attorney, the court also said there was insufficient evidence to suggest Al-Qasem was a threat to the country as an agent of BDS.
The Supreme Court found that Lara Alqasem does not meet the test of a BDS activist. What is more, the court found that the evidence is so weak and so transparent that there is an impression that she was not targeted for alleged activities, but rather for her political opinions. The court held that if that is in fact the case, if she was in fact targeted for her opinions and not for her actions, then that is a very dangerous step to the uncrumbling of the pillars upon which Israeli democracy stands. The court decision ruled that thought policing has zero place in an Israeli democracy.
Security Minister Gilad Erdan, who also denied Al-Qasem's entry at first, suggested, however, that Al-Qasem's studies wouldn't preclude her from BDS activities in the future. He also tweeted, though, that the government will examine the ruling and legal criteria in order to ensure, quote, that the original intent of the law is maintained, end quote.
The Knesset has just passed a long-debated new film law which dictates the structure of how Israeli films will be financed, with 44 votes in favor and 32 votes against. TV's Yael Shir has a report.
Thanks, Aaron. Culture and Sports Minister Miri Regev has promised that the film industry will no longer be an elite or closed group anymore. In the new law, scripts that will receive funding will no longer be selected by the film funds, but rather the script readers will nominate films, and then the Ministry of Culture will decide which films will merit funding.
So how does this change the landscape of the film industry then?
So previously, the films that received funding reflected a very narrow range of society. Regev said that this new law will encourage the making of films by Jewish, Arab, Zionist, and Haredi filmmakers. Previously, only 1% of government funds went to Arab and Haredi films. Now they're actually allocating 7% of funds for Arab culture in Israel, which is a dramatic increase. The Culture Office will also decide the amount of funding that films will receive, and this will be raised to 15 to 20% of the total production budget. The annual state budget to support the industry will be increased by 20 million shekels per year. So it's really a positive change.
Well, and that's a huge increase. But who opposes the law, and what are the suspected drawbacks? Because I can imagine how this policy might limit Israel's creativity in film potentially. For example, just how last month Culture Minister Regev called for funding for the Haifa Film Fest to be re-examined for so-called subversive films. But what's subversive is very subjective.
Well, actually, the truth is many of these subversive films are blatantly anti-Israel and pro-BDS. So, they could cause unnecessary incitement and violence. And I think the goal is to limit the government funds of films that could potentially harm the state of Israel. There were some people who opposed the bill. Israeli parliament member Yossi Yona from the Zionist Union said that although he encourages any initiative by the parliament to advance multicultural beliefs, he also believes that Regev lacks the knowledge to fill the role. He said that she should be pushing the freedom of expression rather than censoring those with whom she doesn't agree.
I mean, there maybe is something to that. We're not sure. Again, it probably depends on the film. But, what did some of the supporters have to say in response then? Yeah,
many political activists have said that the new law will promote films from more diverse backgrounds, which will be definitely a positive and a better representation of Israeli society. They also argue that the government funds should be representative of all sectors, not just the left-leaning cultural elite.
All right, so and what about films that are in fact found to be subversive?
Well, these activists believe that criticizing the government is different from trying to harm the state, such as how those who support the BDS movement are very active in trying to harm Israel. So the new bill will prevent pro-BDS filmmakers from receiving funding and then turning around to use that money to make films that attempt to harm Israel. But generally, films from a more diverse background will hopefully get the support they need to finance their creative endeavors.
All right, well, of course, come back with the updates when the next big film starts production. Until then, thanks for your report, Yad.
Thanks, Aaron.
All right, Israel's popular culinary event hosted by American Express and appropriately called Round Tables is back for its 4th time this year, hitting Tel Aviv restaurants from November 9th through the 23rd. But this year, the Round Tables Food Fest will be focusing on 8 of the world's top female chefs who will be partnering with 8 of Tel Aviv's most favored restaurants for a culinary adventure you definitely will not want to miss.
Hosting restaurants include the Coffee Bar, Zepra, Nitantai, Pastel, Aria, Quattro, and the famous Hayalkon 99 at the Dan Hotel, which is, by the way, the only kosher restaurant on the Round Table's itinerary. Visiting chefs include the Italian Isa Masocci, Anna Ros from Slovenia, Korean-American and London-based television personality chef Judy Chu, American author and chef Gabrielle Hamilton, chef Leo Espinosa from Colombia, Swiss-based Michelin star chef Tania Granditz, Mexican chef Elena Regadas, and finally Michelin star chef Maca de Castro. Yair Bekier, the co-founder of Roundtables, said that, quote, "This year we decided to bring the women to the forefront of the stage, to raise awareness of the importances of women in the field and to create a bridge of creativity, one that combines the best chefs with raw materials, local culinary trends, and of course the most talented artists in the world," end quote. Each of the 8 restaurants will host a particular chef, and during the course of the event, every visiting chef will be offering a tasting menu featuring some signature dishes fused with some of their hosting restaurant's flair. Tickets range in price between 269 and 320 shekels per person, and as American Express is hosting the event, if you order through an Amex card, you can save 50 shekels from your bill and get a free glass of Israeli wine. But you have to act fast, as tickets to dine on these special menus are limited and can only be purchased in advance online at www.roundtablestour.com. All right, it's a new week, which obviously then also means a new successful Israeli television series will be gracing our headlines. And this time it's an Israeli romantic comedy series set for the huge screens of the ABC network. ATV's Emmanuel Kadosh has the scoop.
Thanks, Aaron. Baker and the Beauty has to be one of my favorite shows to come out in the last couple of years, and I'm not just referring to Israeli TV, I mean like ever. The new version of the one-hour romantic comedy series is not far off from the original Israeli version, minus the Hebrew and Israeli setting. This version follows the Miami love story between a simple baker and an international superstar. Noah Hollander, as we know her, is the most famous woman in the country, rich, successful, and has it all. The son of Cuban immigrants, Daniel, who is known in the Israeli version as Amos, is a simple guy who still lives with his parents and works at the family bakery.
Well, this is extremely exciting, and I do love the fact that they didn't change too much of the storyline, because some adaptations, that we see, they keep the main idea, but they change so much you can barely recognize
exactly.
it. And I think that Baker and the Beauty has an amazing concept to begin with, so you don't really need to change that. But who's directing it, who's acting it, writing it?
I agree. I think the message this show sends at this specific time in history is so important and so on point to our society, especially in the States. So far as acting, no names have been revealed, but the Brave creator Dean Jajoris is set to write the script and David Frankel is set to direct. Now, the two men are set to executive produce alongside Israel's TV network Keshet's original producers and advisors for the Israeli take on the show.
Amazing. All right, so some Israeli point of view will take place in the creative aspect of the adaptation. Again, I think that's very respectable and really perfect in keeping the original series, alive. And the original series, it was a hit here in Israel, to say the least.
Literally, to say the least.
Right, like a lot of people started streaming on Amazon worldwide not long ago as well.
Right, beyond right, Aaron. The Israeli version of Baker and the Beauty actually ranked as one of the highest rated scripted series ever in Israel. Wow. The show has aired 2 seasons so far. The 3rd is set to air next month, which I'm beyond excited about. And like you said, Amazon picked up worldwide rights back in 2017, and both seasons of the show are currently available for streaming on Prime Video. Not only that, the format was actually adapted in the Netherlands for Net 5 as well.
All right, so
this is just an addition.
This is just more and more and more. Just pile on the exciting news.
And exposure, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to see some trailers, an actor release.
Me too.
Some names released in the coming weeks. Thanks for the update, Emmanuel.
Thank you.
All right, and now it's time for our Hebrew word of the day. Given the back and forth in court over Lara Alqasem, today's Hebrew word is orech din, meaning lawyer. A lawyer, or an orech din, is a person who practices law, represents a person in court, and generally protects the individual rights of his or her client. But there are many kinds of lawyers, or orech din, who work in various fields such as real estate, criminal law, and many others. But most importantly, an orech din, or lawyer who represents you, legally has to do whatever you decide is in your best interest, as long as it's not against the law to do. So if you ever find yourself in court, which you won't, knock on wood, just make sure that you have a good lawyer or an orech din on your side. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight will be partly cloudy but pleasant with a low of 69 or 21 degrees Celsius. Tomorrow should be clear and with a rise in temperatures to a high of around 89 or 32 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.66 shekels to the American dollar, Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Israel English News and on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you for watching.